compressed orchestrations and dilated spectral conceptions. My wife thought I was giving a childbirthing class. But in reality, we are going to talk about spectralism in percussion. This lecture recital explores compositional spectralism as it relates to unpitched chamber percussion scores using Francois Rose's piece Points d'Emergence as the primary analytical vehicle. And it's actually a great honor for me to play Francois' music here at McGill today. It's a homecoming on a number of levels. Rose studied here in the early 90s before traveling to Europe to study with Gerard Griset and Tristan Muraille. Rose completed his doctoral work at UC San Diego, where he collaborated with a number of you here in the room today at Transplanted Roots. Points d'Emergence is a special piece for me. It combines some of the tenets of spectralism and temporal time in combination with second-wave multiple percussion works, pieces that have a limited number of sound sources but a number of conceptually complex ideas. And so when I first started working on this piece, my question was, if I'm playing an unpitched piece of music, what makes it spectral? The sort of sound bite of what spectralism is always refers to harmonic series and combination of pitch frequencies, and I was like, how does this fit into that? And so that's what we're going to explore today. The role of unpitched instruments is actually fairly easily explained through a technique or concept called harmonicity. Tristan Muraille's simplest description of spectralism, and keep in mind that this is not a dogmatic compositional method. Many people from around the world use spectral techniques. They're not looking to sound like one another. They can be very different outcomes using the techniques in the style. But his simplest description was sound evolving in time. So rather than classifying a sonority as consonant or dissonant, the spectralist might determine the sonority's harmonicity, or to the degree to which the chord's frequencies correspond to the harmonic series. So percussion instruments with a clear fundamental display more harmonicity than those that are unpitched. So the tuning of a keyboard percussion instrument, marimba, promotes harmonicity with its tuning process, while the success of a good tam-tam, triangle, or cymbal requires inharmonicity. So many frequencies. Unpitched instruments are not unpitched. They have too many pitches. So in the slide here, and I'm sorry for the small print on this one, but you're seeing the first 15 partials of the harmonic series up on the first grand staff. Joshua Feinberg, wrote a number of great articles on spectralism, and he did a spectrograph analysis of a cowbell. And so you can see that there's a number of quarter tones and a number of pitches that are outside of the harmonic series, which give it an unpitched sound effect. The second grand staff is the moment that the cowbell is struck with a stick, and so there's noise associated with that from the stick striking, and so that's what we call our attack transient. And then as the cowbell fades, some of the more prominent frequencies show up. And so by the bottom, the fundamental is there, B natural, but you can see even the first most prominent pitch partial is an A sharp. And so we're not looking at a finely tuned tuning system, but that's what creates inharmonicity. So in the setup, Francois asks for basically 3 metals, 3 woods, and 3 drums. And his only stipulation, I can pick any instruments I want, is that the pitch contour of each of the groups must be the same. So I've got 3 Almglocken. And so and that's actually difficult to do. Wood blocks tend to be a much higher pitch partial, even when I've got these bongos cranked pretty high. And so it's a contrapuntal work, Points d'Emergence, but on its own merits, but it's the polyphonic interplay of timbre choices which is of most interest to the composer. There's also some tam-tam set around the instrument. He liked the idea of a plate reverb sometimes being triggered by the sounds. You probably won't hear that in a room this big. And I like, in the spectral mindset, I like to liken any tam-tam reverb that happens as a type of summation or subtraction tone, which is common in spectralism, adding 2 frequencies up and then orchestrating the sum of those 2 pitch frequencies. And that's how the setup goes. And let me see. Good. So Muraille's description of spectralism as sound involving in time implies that the movement of time in macro rhythm is as critical of a structural component of the music as the actual orchestration. Gerard Griset wrote an article that shares the name with his percussion sextet, Tempus Ex Machina, the composer's reflection on musical time. And it served to some extent as a manifesto on temporal proportions in spectral music. The article's pretty bold in that it questions the audibility and, by extension, the validity of formal proportions such as Fibonacci, algorithmic, and golden mean. And his criticism is simple. If the listener can't hear some of the principles and formal structures of the music without the use of the score, then the formal design is, while effective, arbitrary as an organizing structure. So it was one of the first articles of the late 20th century that had people like Boulez and Bartók being called into question in any form. So I find that to be a controversial statement. But his assessment here was not to call for simple forms that everyone can hear, accessibility not so much, but was to outline temporal structures to where the movement of time in the space of music is audible to the listener. And so you see a few of the ideas of musical time that Grisey was working with. Periodic time is basically just pulse-based time, hierarchy of rhythmic units, biggest level of predictability and order. Unlike total serialism, I think that Grisey felt that there needed to be a little bit of periodic time in his compositions to provide repose and a level of predictability for the listener. Continuous dynamic accelerations. Now, these aren't accelerandos, things that happen at the local level. They happen at the phrase level or maybe at the measure level. The best example I can think of this off the top of my head is Ballet Mécanique, the revised version, and there's a section where there's like a 4/4 bar with a big hit, and then a 7/8 bar with a big hit, then a 3/4 bar with a big hit, and 5/8 bar with a big hit, and so on. And so the idea is that it sounds like this structure is accelerating over time, but at a predictable rate. So there's an element of order to it, even though there is time moving or slowing down. A discontinuous dynamic acceleration is basically the time movement that Grisey and Rose, as it turns out, are a big proponent of. A slight predictability but partial disorder. So a lot of times there's tempos changing, rhythmic units changing, polyrhythmics, things like that. The idea that the overall structure of a large section is getting faster and faster, but not at a rate that you'd completely be able to predict. And then the final two levels are statistical, like a totally serialized means of tempi markings, rhythmic groupings, that sort of thing, and smooth, complete rhythmic silence, like a completely ambient structure. This is a formal diagram of points d'emergence. I'm going to repeat this in other slides. Please don't try to read that. But what I'm going to do today for the playing portion of this is I'm going to play the sections as vignettes so you can hear some of the compositional things that Francois is doing in his piece. Separated, and then hopefully at some point in the future you'll get to hear the entire piece in entirety. You'll hear most of it. One of the final kind of component that Francois uses in his piece, as he describes his own writing, is compressed and dilated voices. And so Rose is describing dilated voices as slower pitch or slower pulses, maybe akin to like maybe creating a structural movement of a line or harmonic rhythm, or maybe even a cantus firmus. Quicker, more melodic, more local unit groupings are what he calls compressed. And so in addition to using periodic and discontinuous accelerations in each section of his piece, one or more units of the wood, skins, and drums will be assigned a role of being compressed or being dilated. And so it is very much a rate of pulses type of piece as it's constructed. This is the first measure, and he calls it measure 0 because the end is in the beginning. This is how the piece culminates as well. Rose is almost serialistically pure to having a pitch set in this piece, and you can see it in the wood line and in the second line. Low, medium, medium, high is the theme. And his concept here is that he wants the theme to be so ever-present that it melts together and is not recognizable as the theme, even though that's all you're hearing. So that measure sounds a bit like this. So a listener, if that's the first thing you're hearing, you're not going to go, oh yeah, the low, medium, high lick, I know that. That has to develop over the course of the piece. So that's a measure 0, and the 7 sections culminate in a structure very much like this. I'm going to talk the most about section 1. After this, you might just see the slide telling what happens in the section, and I'll play. But this one I think has the most temporal movement that I want to share with you today. I'll come back to this slide while I'm playing. But you can see some of the texture there. You can see that the bells and the drums are the dilated pitches, the slower pitches. They're creating cannons and a one-to-one counterpoint relationship, which makes the left-hand movement pretty tricky. And then the wood instruments are being used as sort of a melodic role that are also based on the main pitch motive. And this is where the discontinuous dynamic acceleration happens. His goal, basically, the acceleration happens as each phrase, there's 7 phrases, each with a different tempo marking, and those phrases each get shorter and shorter. And so the idea is not only are the pitches getting faster in terms of intensity, but the actual roll of the events gets shorter. So the first section at quarter note equals 48 goes for about 60 seconds. The second section at quarter note equals 60, 35, 23, 21, and 18. And so the idea is the intensity is not just in the playing, but also in the length in which phrases last. But he doesn't want it to be totally predictable, so he doesn't just make it faster, 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 faster. He goes quarter note equals 48, 60, 90, drops back to 68, 81, and 108. And so there's sort of 2 accelerations in terms of tempos, 1 in terms of the length of time. He's not alone in this. This is the opening passages of Tempus Ex Machina, the sort of flagship work for Spectral time, Griset's work. That piece goes on for quite some time, playing just the single player, playing very slow pulses, 45 beats per minute, with wood interjections. 1 player 2 enters, 60 beats per minute. That's only going for 1:18. 48 seconds once player 3 comes in. And so the idea is that there's layers on layers in terms of new tempi, each one of them faster than the last, and each time event that these things happen gets shorter. That's their concept of how he keeps very limited amount of pitch material in play while keeping the intensity growth of it very interesting over the course of almost 6 minutes. And oh, good. Okay, so here's section 1, slightly truncated points d'emergence. And you can hear the tam-tam ringing there. Thank you. Thank you very much. The tam-tam actually does ring there. It's hard to hear in a larger room. We did when we recorded this piece for the CD that just came out. We used a couple of tam-tams in a very small room, and so much of the reverb profile we used actually is tam-tam sound and not that of artificial reverb. Section 2, the last thing I played, low, medium, medium, high. You can hear that sort of pitch set happening very clearly. And then we're dealing with what's called elastic time in the second section. There's a lot of metric modulations between phrases and a lot of rhythmic stretching of the motive within phrases. So I'll play a little excerpt of section 2. And with the entrances of the woods, we work into section 3. Section 3, after all these time tempi that are changing, accelerating, and slowing down, section 3 is periodic and allows the main motive to get some sort of diddles, doubles in it. But it is one of the more arrival-oriented sections of the piece, just because you're not dealing with these shifting tempi every 5-6 bars. So here's an excerpt from section 3. Make sure I got enough room here. And that's a bit of section 3, just featuring the drums in the woods. Section 4 almost uses the main motive, this sort of low, medium, medium, high, verbatim. And you can see that sometimes the pitch unit is happening linearly across all 3 families, but is almost always happening within each single family. And so it's a tightly contrapuntal section. And controlling the dynamic levels of the principal voice with 2 hands covering 3 instruments can be a challenge. Moving on to section 5. Section 5 is just for the woods. And I remember coaching this for the first time with Francois, and of course you see wood solo and you start thinking ribbons and you're trying to get it to happen real fast. But you will miss the point if you do that. This piece is the compressed time is happening just in the permutations. You can see, like in the example here, this pattern. Da, 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 da. And as that pattern starts to develop accents, the first accent's low, second accent is high, third accent is medium, fourth accent's medium, next accent's high, low, medium, medium. And those accents in the dilated accents, or the accents are the dilated pitches, and then when the pattern permutation changes, they become what the accents were before. And so it's a transformational passage. I'll give you just a short taste of how that sounds. And that continues for a short spell. We return in section 6 to woods and drums. The idea here, it's another tricky one if you're trying to get these sort of tactile linear relationships between the two instruments. It becomes less contrapuntal than the composer would like, and he puts more decrescendo and local dynamics than you can think of in here. And so a lot of times the hands have to operate fairly independently. I'll just give you a quick sample of this. The time is moving around again, a lot of tempo changes that are meant to make the time elastic. One thing that is kind of superficial, not known to the audience, is that he picks tempo markings like a Spectralist might pick frequencies. So he has some tempo markings like 81, unstable things usually start to happen, whereas 96 is periodic tempo and 72 his concluding tempos are sort of his harmonic tempi, if you will. Just a little bit of this section and then we'll get to the conclusion. With the entrance of the bells, you know we're into section 7, and you can tell by the scoring. And then in the last section, it's very much like section 4. There are compressed and dilated voices with accents and softer voices using the main theme in all three instruments, but they're a great deal denser. The texture sounds a great deal different, and they culminate in finally the main theme happening in all three instruments simultaneously, just like measure 0. So here is the conclusion of Points d'Emergence. Thank you. Thank you. I know we started a few minutes late. Do I have a second to conclude? Or okay, great. So a couple of things I do want to say about the piece is that Francois, he's now teaching at University of the Pacific in California. His inspiration for this piece was South Indian drumming and the soloistic sounds of the Mridangam when he was composing the piece. However, he doesn't use the influence on any explicit level. There aren't any quotations or borrowing of rhythms, just sort of the tactile nature of the instruments. But I get the sense from him that his deeper influence is time movement cycles in world cultures, things outside of the Western tradition. He recently took a sabbatical to study the traditional music of Japan. And I'm imagining being in kabuki theater and hearing this woodblock accelerating as something dramatic is happening, and finding how such a simple musical structure can actually increase your heart rate and be very exhilarating. And so I've always kind of wondered that there's a distinct possibility that there's a certain stream of spectral composers that are interested in looking to world cultures to find macro-rhythmic structures. In its earliest style in the 70s, the composers were looking at the harmonic series and naturally occurring acoustical phenomenon to fuel their orchestrations, and finding an analog to that in rhythm and time based on naturally occurring temporal sources, maybe from world cultures, might be an interesting avenue for that. Now, Griset himself asserts that his notion of time is linear and in a Western tradition, but in Vivier's music, the musical phrase it proves to favor a certain type of ritualism and sort of an Eastern sense of pacing and sensibility. So that's one of the things I maybe surmise. I mean, the style is not dogmatic. You wouldn't hear two necessarily spectral pieces that sound like they're from the same school, but it would be interesting to see if that's sort of a direction in terms of the time organization that takes place. Any quick questions before I wrap up? Great. I want to thank you very much for having me here. It's like I said, it's an honor to play Francois' music here, and it's a distinct honor to play right before my mentor, Michael Burritt. I don't know that I could do this piece without some of that 4-mallet technique there, so it's an honor to share this session with him. Thank you very much, and can't wait to talk to you after.